Hello everyone, I'm Megan Sullivan from the YouTube channel History and Games, and if you're like me, you're super excited for Assassin's Creed Shadows, coming out November 15th, 2024. This game stars two protagonists, Naoe, a young shinobi, aka a ninja, and Yasuke, a real historical figure. But apparently Yasuke's presence is confusing people, so let's talk about his fascinating real-life story. If you like this episode, please like and subscribe, and I'll be sure to bring you more history and games goodness in the future. Thank you. Now, admittedly, not much is known about Yasuke. It's thought that he was from either Ethiopia, Nigeria, or, according to the early 17th century priest and historian Francois Solier, who briefly mentions Yasuke in his work Ecclesiastical History of the Islands and Kingdom of Japan, Mozambique. Yasuke, whose real name is unknown, was likely enslaved by the Portuguese sometime in the mid-16th century and became the traveling companion and possibly bodyguard of the powerful and influential Italian Jesuit missionary Alessandro Valignano, who arrived in Japan's southern island of Kyushu on July 25, 1579, in the final years of the Sengoku Jidai, or Japan's Warring States period. Alessandro's job was to continue efforts to convert the Japanese to Christianity and spread Jesuit influence in the Far East. Upon his arrival in Japan, however, Valignano learned that despite rosy-sounding letters claiming that the Jesuits were making headway in the archipelago, the missionaries were actually struggling, due to both a lack of understanding of the local language and culture and a devastating civil war racking the country. The cause of the civil war? The total collapse of the shogunate and a series of feuds among dozens of warlords who gave little heed to the central government in Kyoto and fought each other for power. It was not an ideal situation for converting anybody to anything. This might have intimidated a lesser man, but Valignano immediately set about changing things. And by immediately, I mean literally. Within the first week, he had already negotiated a deal with a local warlord from the Arima clan to spread Catholicism in the daimyo's territory, in exchange for Portuguese cannon and gunpowder needed to fight the warlord's enemies. This deal sure wasn't very Christian, but it was very effective. Valignano then started opening up new Jesuit schools, ordered religious texts printed in Japanese, insisted that more Japanese be allowed into the Jesuit society, and most importantly, insisted the missionaries in Japan spend at least 2 years learning the Japanese language, and that included himself and his entire entourage, meaning the man who would become Yasuke also had to learn Japanese. In short, the Japanese people would learn European ideology, while the Christian missionaries would learn the Japanese language and culture. Valignano's plans to strengthen the Jesuit position in Japan kept him quite busy, and in 1580 he scored quite the prize when a Christian daimyo offered to turn the entire port of Nagasaki over to the Jesuits in exchange for participating in Portuguese trade activities in places like Macau. This meant that not only did the Jesuits now have an official headquarters, but also a safe place for Japanese Christians to practice their religion. Still, optimistic as he was, Valignano wasn't stupid. He knew that many Japanese warlords and their subjects were extremely suspicious and at times downright hostile towards foreigners. And in fact, while he and other missionaries were preaching in Kyushu, they ended up the target of an assassination plot. The story goes that a Japanese samurai left his wife and married his mistress in a Christian ceremony. The scorned wife was furious with the Jesuits for allowing the two to marry, and started sending men to attack them day and night. The wife, whom the Jesuits called Jezebel the Witch, caused quite a bit of anxiety for Valignano and his followers. Luckily, Valignano always made sure to travel with a large entourage, both to elevate his status and for security purposes. Wherever he went, his 6-foot-plus African servant was close at hand. Still, it was probably a relief when they found the perfect excuse to leave Kyushu for the main island of Honshu in 1581, when a major opportunity presented itself to Valignano: the chance to negotiate the Jesuit status with the most powerful warlord in all of Japan. This warlord's name was Oda Nobunaga, and he had recently crushed a string of powerful opponents in battle, including the last of the Ashikaga shoguns and the fighting monks of Ikkoiki, a resistance group that objected to the cruel rule of the nobility. Nobunaga had gained a reputation as a terrifying opponent. Happily for the Jesuits, however, he was also a curious Europhile who loved anything foreign and unique. So when Valeriano wanted to meet with him, both to ask permission to leave the country so he could go check on other missionary objectives in the Far East, and to get him on side with the Jesuit cause, the warlord saw fit to let the Jesuits pay homage to him in the capital city of Kyoto, which at the time the Portuguese also knew as Miyako, which simply means the capital in Ye Olde Japanese. Wanting to make a strong impression on the warlord, Valeriano decided to go all out and make a grand procession to Kyoto. But from the moment he stepped onto the island of Honshu, it was a fiasco. You see, Valeriano's very tall and very muscular black servant caused a sensation everywhere he went, especially in the capital. In fact, a riot broke out as people tried to catch a glimpse of the dark-skinned valet. There was such a commotion that according to a letter by Louis Frois, a Catholic priest and missionary who was both a friend and translator of Nobunaga's, recounts that Nobunaga himself wanted to see the valet and ordered the Jesuits to bring the servant to Honnoji Temple, where Nobunaga was staying at the time. Happily, the meeting went well, really well, for everyone involved. Gift-giving was and is a huge part of diplomatic relations, and so when Alessandro Valeriano arrived, he presented Nobunaga with a variety of gifts, including a gold-framed chair that particularly pleased the warlord. Nobunaga in exchange presented the Jesuit with a priceless folding screen bearing illustrations of Azuchi Castle, one of Nobunaga's most treasured possessions. Clearly in a generous mood, Nobunaga then gave the Jesuits permission to build a seminary near Azuchi Castle. Things were going great for Valeriano, and they were about to go even better for his unsuspecting servant. Nobunaga was fascinated by the missionary's bodyguard. He had never seen a black person before and assumed the man was covered in ink. I mean, what else would explain his skin color? When the Jesuit priest informed the warlord that black was a natural color of the bodyguard's skin, Nobunaga refused to believe it and ordered his servants to strip the valet to the waist and scrub off the ink. When no ink came off the valet, the warlord was finally convinced and impressed. You couldn't miss the servant's considerable size and build. But what really impressed him was that the servant already knew how to speak Japanese and could communicate with the warlord directly. Nobunaga was now positively smitten, and right then and there commanded Valeriano to hand the man over. We don't know how Valeriano or his valet felt about this sudden demand, but it's not like either of them had much of a choice. At any rate, Nobunaga immediately gave the former Jesuit valet the name Yasuke, which means something like widely or greatly helpful. But he didn't stop there. Nobunaga also gave him a sword and ordered his men to give Yasuke a proper tour of Kyoto as a way of showing off his new vassal and signaling that Yasuke was now part of his entourage. Wisely taking his cues from his uncle, Nobunaga's nephew also got in on the action and declared he would hand over a huge pile of cash to Yasuke as a sort of welcoming gift. On top of that, one source adds that Yasuke even received a residence. The former servant was then informed he would be acting as a weapons bearer, go wherever Nobunaga went, and would even have the rare privilege of dining with this very powerful warlord. This must have been heady stuff for the former slave, as Yasuke was now part of an exclusive inner circle. And he did indeed go almost everywhere Nobunaga went. For example, when Nobunaga visited Iga province, which fell to his forces in November of that same year, Yasuke was right there alongside him. Everyone took notice of Nobunaga's new vassal, and in a letter written by a Jesuit missionary named Lorenzo Messia, rumors were already spreading that Nobunaga liked his new vassal so much that some people thought Yasuke would soon obtain the rank of Tono, a Ye Olde title meaning lord or sir. Now that might sound like an exaggeration, except this is Nobunaga we're talking about, the man who raised his former sandal bearer to become one of his most trusted generals. That man was the famous or infamous Toyotomi Hideyoshi. In short, everything was coming up Yasuke. Sadly, however, his prominent position didn't last. On June 21st, 1582, Oda Nobunaga was ambushed while staying at Honnoji Temple. The culprit? One of his own men, Akechi Mitsuhide. Nobody knows exactly why Mitsuhide turned on his master. It's still up for debate. But before his enemy could kill him, Nobunaga committed seppuku, ritual suicide by slicing open his abdomen. After that, his body and head disappear from history. Did Yasuke hide it? We don't know. But thanks to the missionary Louis Frois, we do know that Yasuke was with Nobunaga when all of this went down. And after his lord's death, Yasuke immediately made his way to Nobunaga's errand son Nobutada and fought by his side during a fight against Mitsuhide's forces that very same day. Mitsuhide's men prevailed, however, and a possibly wounded Yasuke was finally forced to hand over his weapon. Nobutada and his men were killed, but for whatever reason, Mitsuhide spared Yasuke and ordered his men to escort Nobunaga's vassal to the nearest Jesuit mission, for which Louis Frois and his fellow Jesuits were duly grateful, since they too apparently really liked Yasuke. Now, what happened to him after that, nobody knows. There are reports of other Africans serving various Japanese warlords, including one who manned a cannon on a ship owned by the Arima clan, the very same clan Valeriano first negotiated with upon his arrival in Kyushu. But no name is given to this mysterious figure. Despite his disappearance from the historical record, however, Yasuke continued to fire the imagination of the Japanese, and his popularity surged during the 20th century all the way up until, well, now. Yasuke has always been popular, and it's no surprise to see him pop up in Assassin's Creed Shadows. But for some strange reason, some fans are objecting to his presence in the game, because apparently he was never really a samurai, and therefore is not historically accurate. Really, people? You're quibbling about historical accuracy in a series featuring, what, futuristic technologically advanced aliens or something? Come on now. But it does bring up an interesting question. Was Yasuke considered a samurai? According to a prominent Japanese scholar named Hirayama Yu, whose specialty happens to be the Sengoku Jidai, yes, Yasuke was a samurai. He met all the basic qualifications, namely that he was given a stipend, a sword, which normal servants were not allowed to carry around for obvious reasons, and a residence. All things only important samurai, not some random common servant, were required to have. Add to that the rumors going around that he would be given the rank of lord, and add to that a lowly peasant named Hideyoshi received so much honor from Nobunaga he would end up being the next ruler of Japan. It's pretty obvious that even if Yasuke didn't have a piece of paper he could wave in people's faces declaring him some great and noble warrior, he had all the things high-ranking samurai needed and coveted. So even if you don't believe a prominent Japanese scholar, maybe we should take Nobunaga's word for it. His actions spoke way louder than words. But even if he wasn't technically called a samurai, Yasuke is still the perfect player avatar. After all, he knows enough of the Japanese language and culture to get by, but because he's still relatively new to Japan, and with the death of Nobunaga, is no longer privy to what the warlords were doing, he must learn for himself alongside the player what's really happening in Japan at the time. Better yet, Yasuke just makes sense in terms of gameplay mechanics. You see, Ubisoft wanted to give the player access to two different types of gameplay mechanic, the traditionally stealthy kind, which is Naoe, and a more direct approach, which is Yasuke, who was repeatedly praised in real historical documents for his size and strength. In other words, let's be excited about Yasuke. He looks super fun to play, and I can't wait to embody both him and Naoe when Assassin's Creed Shadows drops this November. But what do you think? Are you excited for the game? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks so much for joining me for today's history lesson, everyone. See you later.